and yell at people when they talk too much.
Okay.
Because I know Mr. Vunic wants to get out there and go sledding as soon as he gets home.
You may sled on the way home.
No, don't say that.
Dr. Remy, the next place you might see me is at the hospital then.
I do not recommend it. I just got a bill for an ER visit that was $12,000.
Just give it to Dr. Remy. He'll take care of it for you.
So yeah, we've got an internal way I can take care of it. Yeah.
I dropped the broadest hint I could. We'll see what happens.
All right, well, it's 6:31, and thank you everybody for this first of 2021's Watershed Erosion Task Force. With that, with permission with our co-chair, Ms. Arnett, would you mind calling the roll call for this meeting?
Sure, thank you. Member Gunther?
Here.
Member Clark?
Here.
Member Boykin? Member Edens?
Here.
Member Sturman?
Here.
Member Holthouse?
Here.
Member Farmer?
Here.
Member Berger?
Here.
Member McCutcheon?
Here.
Member Patton?
Here.
Member Rambo?
Here.
Member McCune? Member Donaldson? I just saw her. Okay. Member Garitano? Co-chair Remy?
Here, Garitano.
Co-chair. Okay, thank you. Co-chair Archeski?
Here.
Okay, and it looks like Ms. Donaldson's here for present, so it looks like we thank you very much everybody for showing. Right now on the agenda, it looks like we've got co-chair comments. Mr. Archeski, do you have anything?
Nothing right now.
So I'll just make just a quick couple comments. Really excited about that we're in 2021 and looking at the agenda today put by Ms. Arnett and Mr. Vunic and others. Really exciting. This is really great because it really formulates a lot of the things that are planned for the upcoming months, and I'm excited by it. One thing I'm not excited by is as Ms. Councilmember Edens had mentioned about, having the horrible experience of every time you look now at a creek, you see the erosion. Mr. Sturman, I purposely have been driving in and around your Point Clayton area because I've noticed that the Strecker Road, Point Clayton, there's a lot more cutting into your area than I previously had seen even just a couple months ago. And I'm seeing in and around the mosque a fair amount of large trees now that have now completely folded into the creek. So I'm really excited that we're pushing this forward. So that's really all my comments is I think that thankfully, we're going to make some good progress this year, and I'm appreciative of everybody's efforts. So on that, we'll move to item number 3 on the agenda, which is approval of minutes. Do I have any questions about the minutes first and foremost? Okay, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as is? Made by Councilmember Farmer, seconded by Councilmember McCutcheon. All in favor of the minutes, please say aye.
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 Okay, all opposed and approvals? Aye. All approval, say opposed to it, please say nay. And any abstentions? Okay, with that, we will approve the minutes from our December 2nd meeting. Next up is public comment. Mr. Newberry, Ms. Arnett, do we have anyone here on the participants that would like to speak?
We do have one person attending in the public. So Mr. Kemner, if you'd like to speak, if you could use the raise hand feature or comment in the chat, and we will turn on your audio for you. I think he's going to pass. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Kemner, though, for coming to our meeting today. We're most appreciative of citizen participation, so thank you. Moving on to the next agenda item is number 5. We're going to talk on update on establishing cost of priority location solutions. Mr. Vunic, would you like to update us on that part?
Yes, Mr. Co-Chair, and thank you. Mr. Co-Chairs and members of the task force, As you know, since 2019, and particularly through all of 2020, the task force, along with its consultants, have been working very diligently on establishing priority locations where erosion in the watersheds has reached a point of concern. That effort led to the establishment of 9 locations. Those 9 locations were presented at the conclusion of 2020, and ultimately the task force voted and accepted them as our kind of working papers for the future. In reviewing those, the Department of Planning is not basically presenting itself as an expert on any of this. However, the Department of Planning recognizes that with any project, there's certain components that go along with it that add time, money, and resources. And so from the perspective of the department, it thought it appropriate tonight, before asking the engineering consultant, John Jones of Wright Water Engineering, to begin the extensive work that needs to be done to begin the establishment of cost estimates for all 9 projects, that it wanted first to offer an option. And in the memorandum that was provided on this matter, the department identifies why it would like the task force members to consider this option in particular. First and foremost, if Wright Water Engineers and the other consultants, Joe Wilson and Dr. David Hammer, are asked to assess costs for all 9 projects, there's a cost associated with that. And as you know, due to COVID-19, the 2021 budget in terms of capital improvements was very slim this year. And Watershed Erosion does have funding, $125,000, but that funding won't go far, particularly in terms of the engineering and the analysis that needs to be done. So that's the first reason why I think doing 9 cost estimates may not be in our best interest. I also then note that regardless of which one or group of 9 we pick, they are all expensive projects in today's dollars. And so identifying what we believe are, let's say, 2 or 3 of the most priority locations, there's a higher likelihood that we'll be able to fund them, just because there will not be that kind of, my gosh, we can't even start to touch these projects at this amount. Thirdly, the department just believes that with a fewer number of locations, we'll be more adept and more able to get the project started, particularly if we do it in a way where we're looking at reasonable projects with reasonable cost. And I think by doing fewer projects and getting reasonable cost and reasonable expectations, the likelihood of success with the sales tax with our residents is greater. And then finally, the department just believes that we can do this because of those 9 projects, we have the expertise on the task force and with our consultant community to identify those that present the greatest risk to public health, safety, and welfare. And those are truly the ones we should look at first. So in the memorandum, the department concludes by just identifying of the 9 projects, 3 that it considers to meet those 5 criteria or 5 perspectives. I recognize that this was not done in the task force setting, so you all are seeing it for the first time. And I also recognize you may not like those 3 projects, and that's fine. I think the outcome the department is hoping from the task force tonight is we pick a few projects and we commit the task force's resources to those few projects, recognizing that the 6 are of lesser importance, but the likelihood of success in the short term with them is probably less. And I guess I'm trying to basically hedge what we've got and make the most of what we can do. And so the 3 projects that the department identified is those interim measures where we just move the gravel around in the creek. We'll need a permit from the Corps, we'll need a permit from MSD, we'll need something to submit to them in regards to that. So there is a component of design and engineering. Number 2, and I know this is probably the most controversial, the images we saw of some of the rear yards in the Evergreen subdivision were very disconcerting to the department at our last meeting. The fact that we have structures attached to a dwelling on the precipice of going into the creek, we need to do something to address that. And if it's just bringing the full weight and authority of the city on MSD and on any social media outlets, any press outlets, we can't let those things proceed, and we need to participate. And then finally, the drainage way in the common ground area by Strecker Road in the Wildwood Meadows Estates subdivision that's been identified. I know it doesn't address the triple meander. It doesn't address the elegant child situation, but I can assure you, we'll spend years on those, whereas we can make progress on a few of these. Mr. Co-Chairs, thank you for your allowing me this extended time to do the presentation. But I think this goes to the core of what we can accomplish in 2020. And so that's why I've taken a little bit more of your time, and I appreciate it. I think the Department of Planning and Department of Public Works are available for questions and comments. And I fully expect you all not to agree and tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine. But at the end of the discussion, hopefully, we'll have a consensus on where we're heading. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vunic. Does anybody else from to Mr. Brown, Mr. Cross, from the city, Dr. Hammer, Ms. Arnett, Mr. Newberry, want to comment first before we open it up? And I've got Mr. Garitano followed by Councilmember Clark, followed by Mr. Gunther in order, but I wanted to give anybody else from the city an opportunity if they have any other further information. Okay, and then one just quick point of clarification. So in those other locations, are you saying that in the calendar year 2021 that we won't at least be able to get projected costs for these projects? Because I think going into that November potential vote, that information, at least as a projected, might be useful.
Certainly, I think there's a way to make it work, but I look at it from the perspective of time and resources as well. And since the task force meets once a month and there's competing interests for the money we have here at the city, the thought is if we're going to spend the time, we should get a product. And I think a successful election would be based upon accurate numbers, a plan for projects, and a timeline associated with them. And so again, I don't want to disregard the 6. We spent too much time, too much energy, and we've given a whole lot to them. But I just feel like we need to latch on to a couple and run with them.
Appreciate that. And just for folks that haven't followed our budgetary meeting in the fall, we also did discuss the possibility at mid-year to consider additional funds being put towards erosion if needed. And that may free up some additional funds if at that point we wanted to try to tackle the least of getting more accurate cost assessments for these projects. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Vunic, I do recall that we at least mentioned that as a possibility.
That's exactly true, Mr. Co-Chair, because oftentimes we start each fiscal year with this grandiose plan, and as things come along, priorities change. By mid-year, we always know pretty well, hey, we're not going to get to this, or we're not going to spend as much. So it's an excellent time to basically reevaluate and then maybe pick the next 3 of the remaining 6 or the 6 of the 6.
Okay, and thank you. Okay, so I'm sorry, Mr. Cross, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment on your latest statement here about the mid-year review. you are absolutely correct that there's always the opportunity to relook at things at mid-year. I do want to caution the task force, however, in that we are 1 month in of that initial 6-month period, and nothing has changed from the results that we've seen in 2020. So I would caution not to count on a big boost or an influx of revenue that we could make a mid-year adjustment to the budget. Because again, 1 month in, nothing's changed, and I dare say that we're going to have the same thing through February. So, it's going to be a while before things turn around. So I just wanted to caution that not to make decisions just assuming that we can make some adjustments at mid-year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you for that sound advice about that. Okay, so first up, we've got my esteemed colleague living in the financial district of Wildwood, Councilmember Garetano.
Thank you. And if it's okay, could I just come after, I believe Councilmember Clark is up next. So if I could let her speak, I'll follow up behind her because my signal is going to get worse before it gets better. And I'm afraid I'll get cut off while I'm talking.
Not a problem at all. Councilmember Clark.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a couple of questions about the cost involved in getting these assessments done. I just don't understand it. Why is there any cost at all? If we go and get them to come up with an engineering plan, I can understand. But if we have just concept proposals, and can we get, and are we only going to go with John Jones, the ones we have here? Are we going to look at like 3 different proposals like we would if we did it ourselves? That's one of my questions. And I have to agree that before we have any kind of a vote on the tax assessment, we would need to have these, all of these prioritized so we can let the, be specific when we give information to the voters. And I really like that you're talking about doing the most EH&S impacted environment, health and safety impacted areas first, and really looking at that. Now I'm asking if these 3 that you're telling us about, are they the most impacted by environment, health and safety? And can we measure that some way? There's one other thing I had, if I could remember it. Oh, the last issue on the list, I did have a question about that. It doesn't look like a project. It says bridges within all 9 watersheds. Doesn't look like a project to me to be part of the, it looks more like we have 8 projects and then a very general statement at the end. Do we have a more specific for that one? That's all I have.
With the permission of the co-chairs, I'll do my best. Certainly who does the assessments in terms of cost, that's at the discretion of the task force. We began with Dr. Hammer giving us the background. Dr. Hammer also then identified what he believed were priority locations within Cox Creek and Bottom Creek watersheds. John Jones had done work in Cox Creek in 2 instances, one a bridge replacement and then the cut bank along Strecker Road. He was familiar with the area and had a good rapport with Wildwood, so to speak. But if you want to look elsewhere, we certainly can. In the state of Missouri, though, you cannot request proposals and ask for cost. Professional services, you must first do a request for qualifications, make your selection of the best firm from those requests for qualifications, and then you negotiate cost or price. We've done that already, so to speak, with John Jones and Dr. Hammer, but we could certainly go back and do more. In terms of most impacted, Councilmember Clark, I wouldn't say that those are the highest of the highest in terms of risk, but when you look at cost, complexity of circumstances, the likelihood of funding and need, I think when you take the risk and then add the other four, that's why I selected them. But again, it's just an individual selection to start the conversation here tonight. And certainly we need to hear from our Department of Public Works. We need to hear from Dr. Hammer. And I'd love to hear from all of the task force members, because the only way we're going to get to that, where do we start, is by all of you telling us as your staff where you want to go. The bridges, that's more of a maintenance item. And I just want to make a footnote here. Today I had a conversation with Dr. Rambo, and he identified on our table a couple of things. First and foremost, we talk about the critical locations, but we don't identify what's at risk, like a bridge, like a road by name, like a pavilion at Community Park. And so with your all's permission, at one point, I'm going to probably add another column or so to the table so that we actually can show this is what we're talking about, and maybe even do a photograph along with it, just to kind of give a picture or a photograph, giving a little bit more weight to what we're describing. I don't know if I got all of them, Ms. Clark, but I'm sure you're all tired of hearing me talk.
Oh, I just wondered if there is a way we can measure the environment, health, and safety for each one in our assessment or our prioritization.
I would believe between Dr. Hammer, John Jones, and then Joe Wilson, the other engineer involved in this process, I'm sure they can give us a standard, give us something that's already out there, or create something that would be Wildwood specific to help us. And I do want to address the first point, which is, why is there a cost to this assessment of these three projects, or whatever number they may be? And any professional, when they spend time is cost. And as you know, professional services come in wide varieties. Some are as low as $90 an hour. Some are over $200 an hour. And my experience with Right Water Engineering has been that they're on the higher end of the scale. And so I just want to use our dollars as effectively as possible. But yes, anytime we ask somebody to do something that's not a staff member here at the City of Wildwood, the cash register starts ticking, so to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Clark, Councilman Clark. Mr. Vunich, I don't mean to put you or others on the spot, but I'm gonna ask if it's okay before we go on to Mr. Garitano and the rest of the group, because I think there may be some utility in this, if possible, given the fact that we've got yourself, Mr. Brown, Mr. Ron, and Dr. Hammer and others on the call. Could we take just a few moments to just go through each of these and just kind of go through what you think are the immediate concerns, but perhaps where the duration of mitigation may take us, and why, and which ones affect certain infrastructure and which ones may not? And then if we just go through them as a collective right now, even if it's just informally, I think that could be helpful and informative as we guide the dialogue for this.
Well, certainly, but I'm probably not the best person to do it. I think I would defer to either Dr. Hammer or our Department of Public Works, but maybe starting with Dr. Hammer.
Dr. Hammer, would that be okay with you?
I'm fine with that, Dr. Remy.
So do you mind if that's okay with the group, does everyone think this will be helpful if we could just go through them in that format and at least kind of just discuss them a little bit? So why don't we start here? Okay, I'll make it a little bit larger if people don't have it up on their screen. And we could start with the first one if you don't mind. And if there are any questions about each of the locations, I still have everybody in the original order, but just send a quick message in chat and I'll make sure that that'll be prioritized just to that location if that's okay. Okay. Your turn, Dr. Hammer. Thank you.
I can't see the bottom sheet on my computer.
I can scroll down. I'm at the top of it right now where we start with the triple meander, but if you'd prefer, we could start at the bottom. Does that help?
Let's start at number 1.
Okay, there you go.
Well, some of these, I had not seen the memorandum yet because I've had computer problems with MU this week, but I'm not sure what sections of the creek you're referring to here, Joe. You say temporary mitigation efforts within main channel. Did you have anything specific in mind?
The highlands at Wild Horse was one of the first areas we identified when we did the field work back in the early part of 2020. I also think there's some value to considering it in the vicinity of that area between Clayton Road on the south and probably Valley Road on the north.
And I think that may also include the triple meander, because when we were out there, we had talked about some possible temporary fixes for that area also.
Well, I'm fine with all those. I really think that we should have some serious discussion about the triple meander at Elegant Child, particularly given that the detention basin has caved in, the creek side of it, because we don't know how fast that's going to unravel at this point. So I think if you're strongly considering some gravel moving just to measure the effects and see what the impacts are and how much time we might buy, that would be the one place to start with it. Right there at the Elegant Child. That one I'd hate to see us totally ignore.
Okay, and just so we can go through these, I think in a more systematic fashion, if we wouldn't mind just taking them, and can we just, for the members that are new to this task force, can we just specify if they have an immediate concern for infrastructure, roads, bridges, specifically in those locations, or are they just a point which are going to affect flow downstream that are going to have that subsequent effect?
The Elegant Child situation is one that could have severe consequences downstream. Remember, it's been a while since we talked, but remember we had discussed the fact that one of the high flow events last year overtopped the meander right there at the Elegant Child, just downstream from it, and actually cut across that. And if that fails there, then we're looking at a complete failure of that triple meander. So of the triple meander mess right now, the most sensitive area is from the detention basin there at Elegant Child, about halfway around that bend to where the stream jumped over the bank. That one, I think, is one that if it unravels in the next year and a half is going to create a situation that may be impossible to deal with the rest of the triple meander.
Would you put these two projects together?
Which two, Dr. Remy?
Triple meander and failed detention basin.
I wouldn't put them together because there's too much there. You'll go through the $120,000 before you get halfway through that. And I agree with Joe that it's really important if you've got a tax initiative coming up to be able to show the citizens of Wildwood that yes, we can go out and actually fix some of these things. So we need to identify some fixable things to do this year. I'm completely on board with that plan. But when we talk about the two locations at that triple meander, it's all part of the same bend. The creek bends almost 180 degrees right there at the Elegant Child. Crosses under Clayton Road. There's a straight shot down to Elegant Child and then about a 180 degree bend, first of the three meanders in the triple meander. And so you're looking at about 120 feet of bank right there that's extremely sensitive. And like I said, that would be the place to do the gravel shoveling. There's plenty of gravel there to move the channel back out 30 or 40 feet away from those two sensitive locations. But it's, as far as I'm concerned, that's one location with two problems.
Would you also locate with that? So in just looking at prioritizations, would you do that before the identified number 3 area? And would that have impact on flow on that area down by Strecker Road specifically, do you think? Or do you think, because I know this is a number 3 on our list currently, but if you felt that this would be more beneficial to tackle perhaps this project, although if we're able to, will that have effects that may actually influence this and move it less prioritization? Although this does affect a road. That's the problem.
Well, it does affect a road and it's highly visible. So I think they both can be done. I would probably start with number 3 because that one is much more straightforward. And I think that the 2 engineers and I can sit down and work with the city engineers and come up with a solution pretty quickly. We're going to have to do some planning and some modeling with the reconfiguration of the channel at Elegant Child, even if we do it only by moving gravel. You may recall that Joe Wilson was talking about grade control structures, which would be coarse riprap. But we need to do some modeling so that we can actually measure some of the consequences and the impacts of what we try to do to fix that and see if it's going to be something that we can apply in other areas as well. So I would say if you were going to do these in a specific order, start with number 3 because it's an immediate and fairly straightforward success and it's highly visible. And then I would go down to the Elegant Child. That'll give us some time to make some plans on what we think might be the best way to approach that.
Are there any questions about these, the triple meander failed detention and the area in and around Strecker Road, for questions for Dr. Hem or anyone else as part of the city? And rather than prioritization of this yet, maybe we should just discuss the merits of each of the projects. But if anybody has questions on these 3 projects.
I have one, if I may.
Okay, sure.
Before, I guess if we talk about any of them, any permanent fixes, I don't know if we're talking about now just temporary fixes to buy some time, but in any of these projects we've been talking about, first started talking about 9 projects to have cost estimates. And I guess they would be preliminary, like pre-construction cost estimates. But before you can even do that, do we not, I know in buildings we had to, but this is different, have to have some engineering work done, at least a preliminary design and set of engineering to do the estimate from first, which is of course going to cost a fair amount of money. And then I'm just curious, we've got John Jones and we've got our engineering staff in place that we're going to use that we, I guess, plan on being engineers of record eventually. And I mapped these areas, the triple meander, and when I walk through there, and because of my background, a big question I have is, do we have any idea at all of even the very basic nature of what the designs are going to be? And I guess the toughest one is at the triple meander, but do we have any idea? Have we done any work engineering design-wise for those? And that's my question. Thank you.
We would be looking very closely at the success we had where the second meander was threatening Strecker Road. And what the things we know that we have to do are to move the channel back out into the middle of the what formerly was, put it back where it was, move it 40 or 50 feet away from the erosional areas now. We have to lay the bank that we construct back at about 30 to 35% slope. We're going to have to vegetate it. We're going to have to use geotechnical fabric to hold sediments and the materials that we place there in place while the vegetation that we plant establishes itself. So we've got a pretty good idea of the procedures that we need to use in this system. The question is exactly what will the design look like? Where will we in place the control structures and that sort of thing? So I'm going to have to sit down with John and Joe and give this some serious thought. We've never really had a chance to do that since they were here in November. But yes, we do have an idea of what would be done. We just don't know how much and where precisely. We'll have to look at that more closely.
So besides the angles repose, geofabric, vegetation being planted, some of the first designs I was shown was also the placement of rock. They seem to have, yeah, and so that will also be part of that design.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, and just one question that was in the chat from Councilmember Rambo. Question just to make sure that we specify the creek. So the first three are all relationship to Cox Creek. The next one is Bonham Creek. The one after that, I just want to make sure. That's Cox Creek. Yeah, let's see, Cox Creek. So is it all nine or all 8 of the 9 Cox Creek, and then 1 is Bonham? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. If there's no more questions on these 3, do you mind just taking us through, Mr. Vunich and Dr. Hammer, your thoughts on this Bonham Creek project here? And how it affects perhaps infrastructure, roads, bridges, and immediacy to needing to fix it, or temporary fixes to help mitigate further problems.
You want to go first, Joe?
Well, relative to the community park, the large pavilion and the playground area are along a portion of Bonham Creek. For the most part, it is not as stable as one might hope. When the engineering team was in town with Dr. Hammer, Mr. Archeski, and others, they did visit that location. And this was a recent addition to the list.
That is the most recent addition, and the real problem there is that we've got a long straight stretch of Bonham Creek that suddenly makes a right angle turn there at the community park. In any place where we have 100 yards or more of straight creek, a lot of energy is accrued as the river or the stream flows without much impediment there. And so we've got one location there right at the bend that is extremely sensitive, but the main problem is there are several really large trees that are already being undercut. 3 of them are adjacent to the park. And if they go, or when they go, that's going to completely destabilize that whole west side of the bank. And you could lose most of the park, including the parking lot and the pavilion.
Remember, everyone, that we're fixing to make this a whole lot worse if we don't do the reserve right.
That's correct.
Any more comments or questions for this Bonham Creek location from anyone? And sorry, I apologize. With sharing the screen, I can't see everybody's hands. So if you use the chat feature, I'll be able to see that. And Councilmember Clark, at the very end of going through this, I have a direct question for you to use your expertise, and I think you'll be pleased. So just be ready. Okay, why don't we go to the next one, which is the bank breach at Highlands at Wild Horse. If Mr. Vunich, Dr. Hammer, and our Councilmember Edens wouldn't mind mention a little bit about their thoughts about that, how it affects, and where the prioritization could be, and associating that with infrastructure. Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember McCutcheon, I didn't mean to leave you out. If you have a comment, please make it before we get there.
Coming up, but my question about Bonham Creek through the community park, if I remember correctly, didn't we at one point mitigate that already, Joe, right after the pavilion was put in place?
Yes, we did a stabilization project using the lessons we learned from the living wall over by the Point Clayton Bridge. That area seems to have stabilized. I think what Dr. Hammer is talking about is generally from let's say the pavilion, the north end of the pavilion, north toward the Great Meadow, and then it makes that first that first 90-degree turn, then goes down by the slide and makes another 90-degree turn. And those are the areas that we've been monitoring for the last couple of years, quite frankly.
So the mitigation we did previously is still in place?
The last time I was out there, which was about 6 weeks ago, yes. Okay. Because as we prepared this list, I tried to go out and visit each of the locations as best as possible.
Okay, and Mr. Remy, can I go ahead and ask the question about the bank breach that's coming up?
Oh, sure. If you want to speak on Highlands, sure.
So, Joe, is this an actual floodplain, or are you just saying it acts as a floodplain?
It is an actual floodplain. And from the perspective of the department, we think we know who created the problem. They just won't acknowledge it, and that's the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District. But what we're seeing is that it's changing the dynamic of the creek as well. And correcting it is a priority, at least from the perspective of, from the department's perspective, the internal flow of the water in the creek itself.
Is there any possibility of getting FEMA funds to address that?
As Mr. Sturman probably can speak better than I, we haven't had much luck finding funding for stormwater, and most FEMA funds appear to be for buyouts to remove structures or buildings from the floodplain or floodway. But I know Mr. Sturman continues each month kind of updating the list and looking at other options when they're presented to him.
Okay. I will have some other comments, Dr. Remy, but I don't want to.
No, that's great.
Down the list, so.
Any more? So thank you, Councilmember Edens, for mentioning about the report specifically on this. Dr. Hammer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Vunich, anything on the bank breach at Highlands that you would also want to bring up, and how this may affect infrastructure and need to get it done earlier, sooner than later, versus other considerations that went into not prioritizing it, at least in your top three?
Well, again, I think this is one of the prime locations to do that temporary mitigation. And I think it'd be a real good learning tool and potential template. And so that's why I didn't necessarily prioritize it, because I've covered it under the temporary mitigation.
I agree with that. And again, that's something Joe and I haven't talked about in some time. There are two other situations there at the Highlands of Wild Horse that are of concern too. And they're both related to the same section of creek. As if you go downstream from where the bank has been breached and we're getting overflow into the common area with all that rock being deposited, go down to the next meander, which turns left. And that bank on the south side is eroding pretty rapidly. When I was out there in October, I measured the distance between the bank and Clayton Road. It was right about 110 feet. I need to go back out there and see what it is now. But just downstream from that, there's a kind of a jog in the creek. And there's two gullies working their way into the common area. One of them's 140 feet long now, and about 8 feet deep where it enters the channel. So if we're going to move gravel, we would be moving it to harden that south bank, and just downstream about 50 yards from that we'd be addressing the area where those two gullies have started to migrate and erode into the common ground. So that would be all one project too. It'd be two particular things in one location, just like at Elegant Child. And the moral of that story is every place that we see something unraveling in the creek, where we have a major bank issue that's causing erosion, there's usually something immediately downstream that's being affected by that. So over and over again, we're going to see when we go out into the creek that we'll be looking at one particular thing, but there will be related issues that have to be addressed at the same time, or we're not stabilizing that entire reach of the stream. It's aggravating. It's really aggravating.
Okay, any more comments on this location before we move on to the next one? And then I'm going to make a suggestion to the group.
Dr. Remy?
Yeah, I'm sorry, who's speaking?
John Gunther.
Oh, sure.
Just a follow-up on this. Joe, you mentioned that it appears that MSD is the cause of the problem. One, is there any chance of getting them to recognize that and fund correction? And number two, if we are doing repairs downstream, does their problem still continue to work away at whatever we're trying to do downstream?
Mr. Gunther, the department, at the recommendation of the two council members representing this particular ward where this property is located, we sent a formal letter to the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District. They responded and basically said they thought it was not their cause, that the work that they had done had not led to it, and that they basically said they had no responsibility. We've tried to re-engage them on that particular item, and we've not yet been successful. Certainly there's probably a better way of doing it than I've tried, but we have reached out to them formally, and the letter was addressed to the executive director so that it went from top down.
Okay, so then if I may follow up, then if we go about mitigating the problem they created, is it just going to keep hammering away at our site downstream because they haven't fixed the problem upstream? Or do we have to fix their problem as well?
That's the $1 million question, Mr. Gunther.
Okay.
Point of information, Mr. Gunther, as well. Upstream from the area that's being discussed, MSD, last I checked, still had significant pipes exposed because of the riprap and small rock and quote bank restoration they had previously done. So they will eventually have to address that, even though it's been reported multiple times. So we will still need to continue coordinating with them and make sure that the repair will not affect any work we do at the point that we're currently talking about.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of issues, and I've been out there with MSD engineers, Dr. Hammer has, Joe Vunich has, and it's been extremely frustrating.
Thank you.
Anyone else have comments on this location? Actually, for one moment, with permission from the group, can I just suspend Robert's rules for a moment? And we'll go back to this in a second. But thank you, Dr. Rambo and Councilmember Edens and Councilmember Garetano. What I was going to wait to tell you, I thought at the end, and I just want to bring it up at this point, because as we're going through these, it might be helpful for members of the task force to think about variables. But Mr. Vunich, what I'm wondering is, after we go through these, is the possibility of creating a larger spreadsheet for these locations, and have the spreadsheet have overall impact score or overall priority score, excuse me. Second, identify the watershed that's affected. Third, temporary repair, yes, no, versus permanent repair. Next, effect on infrastructure, and that's an impact score. So if it's going to have a greater impact on infrastructure, bridges, roads, that would have 1 score, and we'll have that scale delineated. After that, direct impact on infrastructure, and then the second, after that, it'll be indirect impact on infrastructure. But I'm hopeful that if it's okay with you, I think that if we can see those variables and then from that derive at the very end an overall prioritization, I know you probably have already done this, but I think for the task force, it could be helpful. I think that what we're going to find is tonight we're going to talk about these projects, but we may be not in a position, I think, to move forward until the next meeting while I can have a little bit more time to evaluate those pieces of information, unless others disagree. Any comments to that?
Well, Dr. Remy, not to butt in line, so to speak, but certainly our original list was more, I think, a function of the sales tax effort and trying to get an idea of what we could present to the residents. I think the points of the council people and the task force members is that the table unto itself is not sufficient to do what I've done for them. And so I guess my suggestion would be we could probably postpone discussion on this for the remainder of the meeting. I could do exactly what's been described in terms of creating the table, getting that table to our Department of Public Works, to Dr. Hammer, and then taking this back up in February, because we do have additional items on tonight's agenda that probably deserve attention as much as this.
Actually, I will politely push back and say, actually, I think you did a great job with this. I think the memo is fantastic. And I think it's so thought-provoking that it's generating a lot of the discussion I think is important for us to have with a process. So I'm okay doing that unless we want to just quickly go through the last couple properties, though, just so everyone can hear about them so that they can think about it before the next meeting. Unless I think that's probably a good idea, since this is probably the more important part of our meeting. Any objections to going through the last couple ones the way that we've been? And then maybe we could try this approach, if that's okay, Mr. Vunich, for the next meeting. And then we could finalize it. Mr. Berger, I didn't mean to, I know you've got a question. I'll go to you next. Mr. Berger, there we go.
I was just going to comment on the criteria in which we were going to evaluate. So if we're going to move on, I think that's fine. One point I just wanted to make is that the immediacy of remediation, I think, should be considered. So in some of these projects, we may see significant infrastructure impact in a year and a half, 2 years. To some degree, it may not be known until we've made a more stringent assessment, but certainly there are locations here who are in immediate danger that need to be remediated. And I do think that should have a heavy weight in consideration of how they're prioritized.
Thank you. Councilman Clark, do you have a question about what we just discussed, or do you want to move on with the next one?
I just want to mention that when we're doing these criteria, that we, the criteria need to cover all of these areas. They need to cover cost, and like you were talking about, all the quality issues you were talking about. So the quality of the product, how we have to keep how fast we can get it done, the timing, we need to include that, and the overall how it affects the residents, the morale of our city. But number one has to be safety, health, environment, safety. But when we're looking at these, we need to also categorize them like, if you're old as me, you know what a Franklin planner is. And we always learn from using the Franklin planners, which I still use, that there's an importance or an urgency. So all of these are very important, but some of them, as we've talked about tonight, are urgent. So that would be one of the top things that we would have on our criteria.
I think that's an excellent point, and that's great. I think we definitely need to include that in our evaluation. So moving on to the next one, we've got, we're looking at Evergreen and Evergreen Forest subdivisions. This is Cox Creek. I believe this is Ward 5, if I'm not incorrect. Anything specifically about this one, Dr. Hammer, Mr. Vunich, or Councilmember McCutcheon?
Well, with the permission of the co-chairs, this particular set of projects, or this length of creek, was added by the Department of Planning. And again, it comes directly from visual evidence that's been provided by residents that live along this length of creek. This is an urgent matter. I prioritize things by a simple formula, and it's probably one you all shouldn't use, but with yesterday's rain, I start thinking, what's going to go wrong out in the creeks? We get basically 1.5 inches or 2 inches of rain, and I know there's going to be problems. And so that's how I prioritize some of these. And so from that perspective, those yards in the Evergreen and Evergreen Forest subdivisions, where we're already seeing improvements that are associated with the dwelling, either in the creek or at risk of going into the creek, we need to do something. I know there's that problem with public and private funds, But even if it's just, you know, we go down to MSD and we basically don't leave until they talk to us and tell us, what are you going to do? You can't let this happen. And that's why it's a priority to me. It may not be a cost priority. It just may be the resources and time of the task force.
I do not intend to interrupt, but Joe, I'm trying not to be emotional here because I think you nailed it. You know, we got that rain and I'm trying to work, but I'm nervously pacing the house, wondering what's going to happen next. I'm monitoring that the water is muddy, and that means that there's earth in it. And I've seen what can happen. We've had a couple of really massive erosion events. Our property is at absolute imminent danger of being, you know, impacted by any further events. And yes, I do understand that there is some pressure between public and private property, but this is absolutely an issue that is outside of our ability to mitigate individually. And we do need the help of the community to do this. And, you know, I think simply we would love some help to understand who is responsible. And let's make sure that we use the resources we have available to hold them accountable for mitigating any problems.
Thank you, Mr.
If I can just jump in for a second, Ken.
Yeah, just 1 second though, guys. Hey, let's follow Robert's rules from here on in. Otherwise, Mr. Berger, you're out of order. Don't do that again. But I appreciate what you had to say. Councilmember Edens, is it okay for Councilmember McCutcheon to speak before you?
Absolutely.
Okay, Councilmember McCutcheon.
Thank you, Councilmember Edens. I just want to kind of comment on both what Joe has said and Greg has said. This week, there was another big chunk of property that fell in the creek. And people's yards are at risk. We've already had people use a tremendous amount of their yards. And above all, you've heard me say multiple times about public-private. But, you know, the channel there is widening. It has taken away some people's yards already to the point that they have a deck, but they have no yard. It's just gone. And I think Greg's is on another section of it that's pretty much the same as you can see for some of the pictures. But we did have some more of it fall in the creek this week. We've had MSD out there 4 or 5 times, Joe. And they acknowledge that this is a significant problem, but they then out the other side of their mouth is, well, we have no money. And you know, as we've seen many times, when there's a will, there's a way. Sometimes it's reprioritizing or, you know, coming up with a real creative solution. And I know the importance of the other projects on here, but when we have residents concerned even about being in their house because their yard is disappearing, and then we have the additional issue, there is a stream that runs underground in Ward 5 underneath the park and then down by Kingston, which feeds into the creek. And then we have Villages of Brightleaf where the basin right next to the creek is not working. It is not holding any water, but the water is going through the overflow pipe, I think that's what you call it, right into the creek. And I think that's partly one of the reasons we lost that chunk of yard earlier this week in combination with the rain. So as councilperson, I really asking for some support on this. Individuals can get hurt here. I really believe that. I really believe it's at that point where we're gonna have residents possibly being injured because of the necessity of this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember McCutcheon. I've got Councilmember Edens and then Councilmember Rembo, but one quick question for Mr. Vunich in relationship to the council members and Mr. Berger's concerns. Given the fact that this is posing safety issues and we have snow, we're gonna have rainfalls coming into the spring. Do you have any idea from a proposal perspective, the cost that it would be to be able to generate information to see how we could temporize or mitigate this right now if we needed to make a decision for safety reasons?
I would just be giving you my best estimate. Maybe Mr. Brown or Mr. Ron could provide a much better assessment. So I would defer to them because they are the engineers, and particularly in the case of Mr. Ron, he's done a lot of this stormwater work. And so I consider him, no offense meant, Mr. Brown, kind of the expert on some of this stuff.
That's fine. I guess I was going to suggest that we just challenge our consultant team and ask them to provide cost estimates for their effort for all these, frankly, to come up with cost estimates, because that's perfectly acceptable. And they should be more than willing to provide their effort to do conceptual engineering or cost estimates for any of these potential projects. And we should know that, and we can use that as part of the evaluation of which one you want to move forward with first. I don't have a good feel for the cost either, frankly. Dan, I don't know if you want to chime in or not, but I would just go straight to the engineers and ask them.
Yeah, I think it's so. I'm sorry to jump in, but I think it's so. Every problem's so unique. It really is difficult to. It's not like a road improvement where you say, well, okay, we're going to do an overlay here. We know about how much that costs. These things are so unique that
to Mr. Brown's point, that Mr.
Really becomes.
Sorry, Mr. Ron, I didn't mean to cut you off. There was a delay for me. I apologize. Did you have anything more to say, sir?
No. I'm sorry. My internet is also kind of laggy, so I apologize for that.
Well, you've hit on the other problem that we have in the city, rural internet. But nonetheless, Mr. Vunich, to Mr. Brown's point, do you think before the next meeting they could at least give us a sum of the estimates?
I will do everything in my power to have either a general overall number or 9 general estimates. Again, it's just, I was a little taken aback by the invoice I received from Right Water Engineers. That's why I'm trying to not use all of our $125,000 just to generate cost estimates. And again, that's part of the reason I've kind of created this monster right now, that we're trying to go through these 9 projects and understand them. But again, I understand we need cost estimates, but I'd rather spend the money on at least a group that we can agree upon are high priority. And again, I know I didn't give you the information you need to do that, but like I say, I'm cautious with the money we have because we have to make it last at least till mid-year.
Again, and I'm not suggesting that they do the work. I'm suggesting that they tell you what their level of effort will be to do the work.
That I can do.
What are they going to do? What effort are they going to do to come up with a cost estimate and a concept design for each of these problem areas? So we get an idea of what it's going to cost.
Good point. I can do that, sir.
Perfect. Thank you.
You can ask the question and see what the response is.
Do we need another item here, whether it's private property or city property or county property? Do we need something that lists the private property and maybe prioritize them within this table?
Mr. Co-Chair, I'd be glad to do that as part of the matrix.
Okay, thank you.
The only other additional point for the matrix would be if you think that there's any sort of possibility for cost share with any of the utility companies or anything else that may have also interests in that location. And I know that doesn't mean that we're going to get any cost share. I just think it would be nice to know whether or not we think that there's relevance.
Well, Dr. Remy, I'm an older man. And so in my mind, every project starts at a manhole and every project ends at a manhole because they're at risk. And everywhere in between is what we want done.
Fair enough. Councilmember Rambo and his feline friend.
Yes. The picture that Kathy showed and Mr. Berger's comments and the comments of others, they're heartrending. And we have to do something. I feel compelled, but I I just want to mention that this is virtually all Cox Creek at this point. And it's going to be hard to sell this to the entire community if the only projects that are on our radar screen are correction of Cox Creek's problems, particularly when we have homes that have actually flooded. And so we should have some sort of decision criterion for the damage that has already occurred, damage that's occurring, like that slab that Kathy showed, something like that, because it will be hard to explain to folks on Fox Creek who have had $50,000 insurance claims that, oh, we're going to fix these yards because their deck was only 10 feet from the creek when it was built, and now it's eroded. And again, my heart goes out to all those folks, but I'm just trying to think practically about how to benefit the entire community as we go along with this. That's my comment.
Thank you, Councilmember Rambo. Councilmember Edens, I apologize. You were next and I skipped you. I apologize. That was not on purpose.
Oh, I know it wasn't on purpose. That's okay. Rob actually just said some of what I was hoping to say, but I know we have a lot of council members that were not on when we first started this committee, and certainly a lot of new public volunteers. So just to rehash what Rob was referencing with Fox Creek, in the very first meeting this committee had, we had some citizens that showed up that thought they could get help. At the time, there had been substantial flooding. In fact, I'm sure you can remember the news articles where the horse floated down the street, and they felt that their lives were threatened. And as a committee and as a department, we sat there and told them, we sympathize, we're sorry, call FEMA, it's a private yard, it's your problem. And so I'm struggling with the evergreen priority, because other areas are kind of in that quasi-public range, and this is backyard. And we sat there and we told those scared, upset people, you're on your own. And so I'm concerned that there's not consistency and there could be issues with managing expectations. I think what could be appropriate would be some sort of press release about how, severe this area is in Evergreen, contacting MSD and maybe the homeowners, just for consistency's sake, offering to do a cost share directly with MSD rather than a city cost share. And there also needs to be a discussion about scope. So what does it look like when we're saying mitigation? Because I can tell you, I've been out to yards where it's eroded up to the deck, and I've had to tell that homeowner we can't do anything. And MSD, just so you know, when they come in and they mitigate damage, they go to the point that it's eroded, and they will not extend your yard back out to where it used to be. So you're not going to gain those feet you lost back if MSD does it, or at least that's what the engineer told me then. So my question is, when you're doing cost estimates, what are you including? Are you including the concrete slab cost that was broken, or are you just fixing the bank? Because it's also not, MSD is not going to pay to fix that deck. They're just going to keep it from, going down, nor should the city. So there needs to be a more detailed cost of what a fix looks like. And if we're going to put in effort contacting MSD and advocating for these citizens, which we should, we need to turn around and go backwards and do that for those Fox Creek folks, for consistency's sake. But yeah, I do have issues because it is a private yard and what our position has been in the past. So I'm hesitant. I know it's a life-threatening issue, but I agree with Mr. Vunich's suggestions that there are other ways we can try to do it without spending some money there. I think that's a good point. And my area certainly doesn't have to be worse. I'm not an engineer. I'm a little bit luckier that mine's in the quasi-public and MSD's jurisdictions and our bridge and things like that. So I know there's a lot of citizens that are going to say, it doesn't seem fair, it doesn't feel fair. So we just need to have a message and really stick to it, because I feel like we're no longer sticking to that original message from the first meeting.
Mr. Vunich, you're next, and then Councilmember Garitano, you're after Mr. Vunich.
Thank you, Dr. Remy. And I do want to note that I think Ms. Holthouse has had her hand up for a bit, so I don't want to butt in line again. But I just want to emphasize that the department's not being insensitive to those others, let's say, suburban traditional subdivision areas that back to creeks that are also experiencing similar circumstances as the Evergreen subdivision. Certainly, I don't want to leave those off the list. In defense of the department, I was working from the 9 priority projects that have been established by the task force. I also just want to draw one conclusion about Fox Creek. There are individuals that have lived in this area the entirety of their lives, some more than 60, 70, 80 years. And the flood that caused the problem in Fox Creek and prompted those individuals to attend our Watershed Erosion Task Force meeting, those people, I've heard people say in the 57 years I've lived here, I've never seen the water that high. That was an unusual event. I think they actually classified the storm as in excess of a 500-year event. So I don't know how the task force feels, but I'm inclined to address those situations in the watersheds where every rain's a threat, not a 500-year plus event rain. And that's the rationale.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich. Councilmember, Member Holthouse, I'm sorry. I didn't know, was your hand, I think your hand I had you up for previously, but if you re-put it back, I apologize. Is it something on this specific item?
I think it's a question that underlines several of the locations and does speak to priorities.
Okay.
And that is that I've heard the solution of moving the bed load around and stabilizing the banks that way as an interim movement, and I think it was even called a learning tool at one point. So my question is that something that really is quasi-experimental? And if so, should we maybe pick the easiest location and get going on it and do some data collection to see about whether that is really a breakthrough, relatively low cost, fast fix, or something that washes away with the next storm, and learn that early rather than proceed with several locations and then discover that was a big winner, or maybe not so much. So I guess that's maybe a question for Dr. Hammer.
Yeah, Dr. Hammer or Mr. Ron, do you want to take that?
Dan, do you want to go first? Well, I'll go ahead and address it then. First, I'd like to say that what Joe said a minute ago is extremely important. There's been a lot of reaction to the amount of rain we had in one event in the fall of 2019. And if you recall the work I did and the graphs I made on the rainfall in Wildwood over the last 35, 40 years, that period of time was really an outlier. It could happen again next week. It might not happen again for 350 years. But being pragmatic about the variability of extreme events and their rareness, I think Joe is absolutely right that we need to focus on the locations that are affected every time we get a rain of any kind of consequence. The issue of moving things around in the creek, I think it's something we need to do, at least to see if it's going to work. And if it does work and some of those materials stay in place once we put them there, then we've already got a start on the final resolution and remediation at that location. We can go right over some of the rock that's been moved and bring the soil in that's needed to establish vegetation and really solidify that particular location. So if going back again, if we were going to pick one place to do that, which I think is a good idea, I would suggest again doing it at the Elegant Child, and there's a couple reasons for that, other than the fact that you're getting two birds with one stone there, and it's an extremely critical location. The second one is it's going to be easy to get to. A lot of places in Cox Creek, it's going to be a major effort to get heavy equipment into the creek, or you'll have to enter the creek someplace remotely and bring your equipment down the creek to do the work. But right there at Anniversary Park, the access is easy. It's highly visible. It's a place that you could, if it's working well, you could make it a place that people could go look at and actually see what the results are and have an idea what we're all about. So those are two reasons I think that in addition to just the cost and the need to do this experiment and see what happens, that's why I think that would be a good location to do that.
Mr. Ron, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry about that. No, I mean, I think for me, I mean, I think in terms of moving bed load around, I personally don't have experience with that, but so I can't really speak to that. I mean, I think in terms of relative cost, it probably is the least expensive thing. But I mean, you know, working with our consultants, I think that's going to be our best place, is having our consultants tell us, let's move this bed load, you know, because that's the best thing to do. I mean, does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to go to Councilmember Garetano, then Councilmember Clark, and then if it's okay with everyone, I think we've talked about the last three items. I think we started with the first one anyway with Dr. Hammer, and then the other two I think are somewhat self-explanatory, so maybe we could come to a conclusion about where we go next with this. But Councilmember Garetano first.
Sure, and I have some comments, as I mentioned early on, you know, up first. So should I just cover them all now, or are we still just focused just on the one item here? Because I do have just one item relative to where we were talking about the Evergreen and Evergreen Forest subdivisions.
Why don't we do this? Let's take your question or your comments on Evergreen right now, and then if you don't have anything specific to that, we'll go to Councilmember Clark. And why don't we just see if there's any more comments by our experts on those other last three areas, and then we'll go to you first to give overall comments, or maybe where you think we next best go.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I am, you know, I am very sympathetic to the issues that are occurring over there at Evergreen and Evergreen Forest and Mr. Berger's property. And we have, as Councilmember Edens mentioned, other properties as well that those property owners have come to the city for help. What I'm just really concerned about, and I would probably have to defer to our city attorney, is that it's always been my understanding that it is state law that we cannot use public money on private property. And that was the answer that was given when there was a question at one time asked about Lake Chesterfield and that being a private property belonging to the HOA. Someone had asked about that, and I believe, I don't know if it was the city attorney or Mr. Vunich, maybe it was you, I don't recall, but the answer was that there's a state law, and I think I found it, it's Article 6 of the Missouri Constitution that says that. So really it's not, you know, something even Wildwood is the one that's coming up with the constraint. I do think we just need to make sure legally we're not going to put ourselves at any kind of risk of breaking the law, you know, because that's just my concern. So.
Thank you, Councilman Garetano. Mr. Vunich or City Administrator Cross, any comments on that, or should we ask Mr. Young prior to the next meeting specifically on just that issue?
Kim, will you add me to the list again?
Well, with the permission of Mr. Cross, again, in the case of Mr. Berger or any of his neighbors, or in the case of the property owners Ms. Edens has visited, or any others, in some instances, Mr. Berger could go down to MSD and stand on their doorstep for days, and they may not notice. They may not respond. They could. I guess what I'm saying is maybe not all the solutions to the priorities are putting money toward it. Maybe some of it is putting our time and resources, meaning that we can use the press, We can use social media. We can try to spur MSD into taking action. The best approach for MSD is we say, well, there's nothing we can do, and we let them keep the status quo. And in some instances, I don't think that's fair.
I agree 100% with you, Joe. I think that is something we have the power. We have advocacy, and we have the ability to put pressure. And I 100% believe it's a responsibility we have to our residents that, like in this case, the accountable party, if it is MSD, then they need to step up and own it, and unfortunately that I think has been a problem, not just at MSD, but I think it's with other utilities that, they're not getting that kind of pressure. And I think we have that ability. And I love what you're saying, Mr. Vunich, the ability to put attention to it, give it good press. These utilities do not want to get that kind of attention. And that might be just what gets them moving on it. And I would love that battle with them.
Great points. And we're going to go next to Councilmember Clark. Mr. Kemner, thank you for your comment. Just a point of clarification, common ground is generally private land. It's owned by your HOA and your development. It's not city property. So it's not public property by any stretch. So just want to make sure that there's an understanding of what we're exactly talking about. Mr. Brown, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, you certainly didn't. I was just going to speak to the issue of spending public money on private property. And my understanding of it, and in particular, if it's being done for the public interest and safety, we can do it. It's just that essentially we do buy that problem. So we would have to take a permanent easement of sorts that would tie us to that area and the maintenance of that area for perpetuity. And I suspect those other cut bank repairs that we did that very thing over private property. So it can be done, but it's certainly something that this task force needs to consider moving forward, because frankly, if there is suddenly monies to be spent on stormwater, this issue is going to be front and center. How do we address and how do we prioritize repairs on properties that are essentially private, but there may be a public interest in doing so as well. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah,
great point. Great point, Mr. Cross. Sorry, you.
I'm sorry, you may not be able to see me with the.
No, I can see you. You're up.
All right. But I wanted to respond to you had asked the question earlier to respond to Mr. Garitano, and Mr. Garitano is right. Mr. Brown is correct. In the absence of any easement acquisition, the city is not, and Mr. Young has pointed that out. So it is he that did counsel us on that. We cannot spend public money, federal money, if you will, for private property homeowners in the absence of acquiring any liens or anything like that Mr. Brown just pointed out. We would be precluded from doing that. We could do the bank, but we cannot go onto private property with city funds.
Thank you for clarifying that, all of you guys. Councilmember Clark, I believe you're next, then it'll be followed by Mr. Berger and followed by Councilmember McCutcheon.
Just a quick comment. If we do go ahead and take on work on private property, whether if it's no cost, and we go in and we do that work, I still think that we need to have some kind of a specific to that the homeowner has to meet to be considered, so that it doesn't look like we're picking and choosing who we consider to help, because everyone is going to think their issue is the worst. So I think if we have like a list of also a criteria for even getting your problem put before the council and before the department, that there needs to be a list of things that they meet.
That's a great point. Mr. Vunich, just a point of just relation to this project, is it possible that we could get the HOA members, Mr. Berger, et cetera, to also have their own dialogue with Land Learning, which also may be a potential alternative? Would that be possible, do you think, or is that you don't think a reasonable alternative also for them?
I think given the circumstances in that section of creek, we should offer any and all options. So we can certainly get with the trustees and let them know that there's an entity out there that might be able to do some remediation sooner than the city or MSD.
Thank you. Mr. Berger, you're next.
Thank you, Dr. Remy, for that suggestion. We certainly appreciate any and all opportunities to remediate the issue as soon as possible. I can speak for myself, and I would venture to say that, anyone else who is bringing problems forward, especially as it pertains to public versus private property, is not suggesting that the city is responsible or culpable for any of the issues that are going on. And in fact, the first step, in my opinion, would be to get some very clear understanding of who would be responsible. And the ask then is to have the community support in putting pressure on responsible parties to resolve the issue. And certainly, if that is an individual homeowner who is responsible for remediating that issue, that's a new conversation. And either something they're going to have to figure out on their own, or they can kind of go back to the drawing board. But in my experience, this is a problem that is outside of our grasp to be able to resolve ourselves, and we need some help, and that's all we're asking for.
Thank you. That's appreciated. Councilmember McCutcheon, I think you're next, and I don't see any hands after that, so we can continue to move on.
Thank you, Dr. Remy. Definitely the residents are in peril, and I realize that this issue goes into private property, but it's actually being caused by the creek bed and the creek bed erosion, which is not private property. So I'd really like to stress that point, because we're not asking the city to go in and replace individuals' yards or decks or whatever. What we're doing is we're asking for mitigation to occur so that the residents no longer lose their property and are no longer placed in peril. So we're not asking for public money to be spent on a private issue. We're asking for public money to be addressed to the creek bed, and it has widened substantially.
The creek bed, according to St. Louis County property, belongs to Evergreen residents. Just a point of information.
There is common ground there that belongs to the HOA, but I don't believe the creek bed belongs to the HOA.
Yeah, Councilmember McCutcheon and Mr. Vunic can correct me if I'm wrong. We had the same problem in my area. We thought actually the same, and we were incorrect. It actually is privately owned by the homeowners in that area and the association and parts of it. So I don't know if your area is different, Mr. Vunic. Is there similar to what we've experienced as well?
Just to give you some history, when MSD was formed by vote of the residents in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County, they took no ownership, but were granted rights of easement to all the waterways. So the underlying property is still privately owned in most instances. The MSD has an easement that grants them rights of access.
Dr. Hammer, I'm sorry, I missed your hand up.
You're on mute, Dr. Hammer.
Dr. Hammer, you're on mute.
Thanks. I had to do that because my cat was in the background. When he saw Dr. Rambo's cat on the screen, he went nuts. I was saying that the issue of evergreen forest and evergreen with the creek encroaching right up to virtually patios and the need to get an estimate. Joe had mentioned how expensive right water engineering is. We knew that was the case, but they're expensive because they're really, really good, probably tops in the country. But they did bring in Joe Wilson, who's local and who's close and who has done work in fluvial systems all over southern Missouri, which are really similar to Cox Creek, and has worked with engineering firms in St. Louis. These were conversations we had separately. and didn't get into it too much when they met with you folks back in November. So I wonder if it'd be a good idea, Joe, to get in touch with Joe Wilson and have him come up and look at those locations in Evergreen Forest and see what he can do. His cost may be substantially less than Right Water Engineering. And he was picked specifically by John Jones because of his long history with Joe and his knowledge of Joe's expertise. So that might be something to do so that we can at least get something going in the first 6 months here. This would be a good time for Joe to get out there and look at it because there's no vegetation. And he had a recent flow event that he can factor into whatever he's considering. So that might be something to do. Just so we can get something started for some particular individuals and say, hey, we're on the way here.
Well, following Rick Brown's suggestion, I'll ask Mr. Wilson to do the same I'm going to ask of Right Water Engineering, and not necessarily pit the two against each other, but just in terms of proximity and cost, maybe using one just for this particular issue to get it started.
Yeah, I don't think they would view it as competition. When we were in the field, I asked the question a couple of times, and Dan may remember this too. We did, I think it was when we were over at Wildwood Meadows, we started talking about this, and John Jones was pretty clear that he fully trusts Joe Wilson. And in those situations where we need some quick answers and Joe is handy, John's perfectly fine with Joe coming in and giving his observations and making his recommendations and passing them through John. So I don't think it would be viewed as a competition at all, particularly if you copied John on the letter and explained what you were doing. And it's a good way to find out what Joe brings right off the bat.
So in the interest of time, because I think we've got some ideas, perhaps land learning and as Dr. Mammer just mentioned with the other entity, and then also moving forward to see if we can get some at least estimates for what Mr. Brown had suggested with the other group or other consulting group. If that's possible, I think that coupled with perhaps just presentation of the data that I know Mr. Vunich has that we could then use in a prioritization factor. If there's no objection, perhaps I think we've got enough actionable items before the next meeting. And even though we're not going to necessarily take a vote on this tonight, is it acceptable for us to move forward to the next meeting, where at which point then we can hopefully make a motion to go to council? Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I just wanted to leave you with this information that the city attorney has in fact confirmed for us that public funds cannot be spent on private property. However, Mr. Brown was correct that depending on the circumstance and depending on the definition, those funds can be spent if there is a public purpose. It's a broad term, but individual homes may not quite fit that definition. Again, it depends on the circumstances, but that is that's the response from the city attorney just now.
Okay. Any objections then to moving forward with the actionable items as is, and then we can finalize prioritization at the next meeting. Okay, if none, I'd like to just close this part of the meeting, and then we can go on to the next agenda item, which is going to be recommended direction to City Council on Parks and Stormwater Tax and Sales Initiative.
Again, Mr. Co-Chair and members of the task force, as you may recall, a decision was made by the task force at the end of 2020 to proceed forward with placing the sales tax proposal before Wildwood voters sometime in 2021. Ultimately, the discussion led to a motion that the park and sales tax be presented in November 2021 at a 1.5% of 1%, and that it have no sunset. The Department of Planning, following the direction of the Watershed Erosion Task Force, prepared the draft letter that's before you tonight. The letter is being presented for your comment and direction. I would note that as the City Council has been going through their strategic planning effort for the 5-year window between now and 2026, I guess. The letter may be held up depending on the progress made there, but certainly I wanted to get the letter to you in draft form to get any of your comments. And once I have the comments, then I can finalize it and have it prepared for City Council when the opportunity arises. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Munich. City Administrator Cross has something to say, and then Mr. Garitano, I apologize, I must have forgot to come back to you, so I'll go to Mr. Cross first. Mr. Cross is yielding towards Councilmember Garitano.
No, I didn't have my hand up. I was just saying that the strategic plan is 2021 through 2025. So no, that's all. Thank you.
Perfect. Councilmember Garitano, I know you have a good comment to make. I apologize.
All right. Well, I guess my comment was related to before, but I think it applies really to all in general. So, and I'll try to keep it short because we are running late. So first, great job by everyone on everything that has been done so far on this work here. And I was reflecting back on really what we've got ahead of us. This is massive, this project here, or at least all the scope that we have here. And to what Joe mentioned before, I agree 100%. I support his comments regarding prioritization, and Councilmember Clark mentioned it, prioritization as well. I do think it's important. And obviously, the discussion of how it's prioritized, that's a separate conversation. But the more and more I thought about this and how massive it is, I mean, we're talking about a system here of these watersheds. The more I think about how this is more and more a multi-year program that is going to consist of multiple phases. And I do feel it's impossible to address it all at once because, it'd be like trying to attempt to boil the ocean. And the reality is we can't do it. We just can't from a logistical and also from a financial perspective. So this is where I'll tie in with the tax. With the expected revenue of the tax, which was, I think, 1.1 million, to fully fund at the very low end, I think the quoted number was about 19 million. It would take us probably about 40 years to get to that number, because remember, the tax has to be split with parks. So if we're taking 1.1 and I'm just breaking it down in half, let's just say half, that's 500,000 a year. So the tax is not going to be our saving grace. We're not going to get all that money at once. We're going to get it each year, and we're going to have to split it with parks. And so the reality is we are going to see, depending on how we split it, somewhere around $500,000 a year, and maybe it might be a little bit more with that. And so that's why the reason I do feel the prioritization is important, and that we do put together some phases. And these phases, I think, will be good because we can achieve some true valid wins with this. We can get through phase one, and whether it's like those top 3 items on the list that get executed, we'll get there. Another thing too with the tax we have to keep in mind is that, the city back in 2018, we had Proposition 4, I believe, that was approved by the voters. So any project that's over $3.5 million requires a separate vote by the citizens of Wildwood. So not only are they going to have to vote on a tax, they're going to have to vote on approving a project of that massive cost. So that's just something I think we might have to keep in mind, how these projects add up and if they go over 3.5 million. And I believe part of Proposition 4's intent was that you have to look at the collective body of work. You cannot break it out into multiple phases. And I believe that's kind of like separate from maybe how the community park was addressed, where that's done by multiple phases, but I don't recall that there was a vote for that. So that might be something we need to make sure we look at. So just to really summarize my comments, prioritization and a phased approach, and really having realistic, achievable goals is probably going to be the best way for success to get here. I don't want to, I think trying to attempt to boil the ocean all at once is going to be too much of an undertaking for us. So those are just my comments that I wanted to throw out there, and just for the committee, the task force to keep in mind with regards to it. I think the accountability for the tax is important. We need to have we have to have the story to be able to tell to the residents as to where the money is going, right? We cannot ask for the money and not be able to explain how it's going to be spent. And that's why if we have the multi-year program with the phases, then we can map it out, because that way we can project what's coming in and where it's going towards what. So that's it. Thank you to Councilmember Co-Chair Remy.
Thank you, Mr. Garicano, Joe. That was fantastic. I do have one question, and then I'm going to go to Councilmember Rambo and then Councilmember McCutcheon, but I'm actually going to ask Councilmember McCutcheon a quick question. For this, even though we voted for this 2 months ago, I'm curious to see about, for the spirit of at least hopefully what we're going to get out of this, if Parks and Planning, your committee will take this up also to put this to council to demonstrate also an interest in pushing this forward. I think if both committees at both sides of the coin are pushing it forward, it demonstrates, I think, a bit more potential to have success with unity. But I don't know if that's something you're thinking about as well for your committee.
We've already started that process last night, and we gave Mr. Vunich several items that we felt like we needed more information before we could go ahead with an official statement of support. Can I just really quick?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yes, you can jump to the line since I picked on you.
Thank you.
Then Councilmember Rambo.
I just want to make sure that everybody understands that the community park, we have not gone over the 3.5 million as a project as a whole. We're getting close to that. So then we would have to go back out to the public for permission to continue with that. But to date, we have not gone past 3.5. I just want to make a clarification.
Thank you. Councilmember Rambo.
Thank you. I want to support Councilmember Garicano's comments without parroting them. This is a similar prioritization problem, the financial side of it, to the prioritizing of the actual problems that we have. But yeah, on the financial side, I'm very afraid that park improvements would be subsumed into the erosion work. And Mr. Garicano mentioned that the money will be split 50-50. Is that to be determined? Can that be, is it for the council's decision on an annual basis, or how exactly does that work? I have that question, but I have another comment after I get some clarity. Can one of the city folks answer that question?
And just a point of information, that's just an assumption. I think I said it. I'm just speculating half. I don't know what that number is going to be.
Oh, okay. So we have to be real careful, because we're going to try to gain approval from the community. They've already shot a parks and stormwater tax down once. And I don't know which part will be more palatable to folks, but we only have one shot to kill the three birds of erosion and parks and internet and so forth. And it seems like it might be more sensible to try to be strategic about, what money is going to go where and how much we need to ask for, and figure out how to fund all those projects. Because right now we're talking about it in terms of stormwater, parks are near and dear to my heart, and I don't want them to. I don't want folks to think suddenly that they've funded parks, but we don't have any money for parks because we're spending it all on erosion. And then we still have the internet thing, and we haven't figured out how we're going to fund that. And so this half-cent sales tax is not feeling as good as it did before. And so my basic question is, is there an opportunity to think about this strategically before we go forward with just trying to put the half-cent sales tax on the ballot, because people aren't going to support, two different kinds of taxes anytime in the near future, as far as I'm concerned. And we have to do internet as well.
So Councilmember Rowe, just to your point though, so this is to go to council to approve this to go forth, but we're not approving the percentage breakdown. That percentage breakdown could be 90% erosion, 10% parks, and it can alter and it can waiver year to year. We also don't need to put an expiration date on it. We can leave it open-ended versus doing it for 10 years. I think
that was the motion, by the way, was to not have a sunset, but
correct.
If we split it 50-50, if we don't split it at least 50-50, the parks won't have any, enough money to support them and improve them. And if we throw $1 million a year at the erosion, it won't be enough. So I'm just concerned that we're kind of chipping away at the problem. And you've mentioned numbers up to $30 million. Again, I have no solution. I'm just wanting to make sure we consider this.
And in efforts not to get in a huge debate with Councilmember McCutcheon tonight on this, to be perfectly candid, and I'll make my feelings known. Our parks are currently funded in a lot of ways. I mean, there certainly could be other things that we can certainly do, but erosion's not. And so I don't foresee this being 50-50 for the first upcoming years, but that's not going to be to a detriment to parks. Parks are going to continue to be utilized in the fashion that they are. There'll certainly be maintenance issues, there'll be other issues. But as we speak, and as you sat through our budgetary meeting, we've only allocated less than $125,000 for erosion, with a plan over the next 5 years, potentially for $500,000, which includes that $125,000. And so to be perfectly honest, in hearing what we've heard thus far tonight with Evergreen, and hearing what we've heard about with what you mentioned for Woods Mill and Elegant Child, to me, those demonstrate significant threats over the next 10 to 15 years for this city. And I would think that we would want to make sure that that's priority, not only safety, but damage to potential people's property and public property, that it may not be allocated 50-50. In fact, it may be a detriment to do such. I would think that we would want to allocate it a higher percentage specifically for this imminent danger.
So my final comment on that, since I think I still have the talking stick, if folks approve this sales tax and things go south on our revenue streams, as they may indeed do in the next few years, people are going to say, wait a minute, what happened to the money for parks? If we don't get around to some of the park improvements that we're planning and so on and so forth, we have to make those tough decisions. It will make it harder for us to justify, because people think parks are funded now because we voted for the tax. And I'm told that we learned last night that the way it, and we may have heard it tonight, that the way it came about was a quarter century ago, when communities around us were making sort of linear parks in the riparian corridors, and it made sense to say, okay, this is parks and stormwater, because we're making all the parks right along the river or the creeks. And that's no longer the case. It's kind of split, but the nomenclature hasn't split. And so I don't know a solution again, but I'm very afraid of approving this tax and using it as a revenue stream when it's all going to go to stormwater, and the parks may get short shrift down the road.
But the point of, we're not saying that, Rob. We're saying that we're putting the tax to council to vote on. But what you just highlighted, you actually demonstrated a reason why this is so important. If our revenue stream in the future has significant deficits or problems, then we in fact do have a method that annually we can alter the percentage between the two if there is a need to add it towards parks. You just highlighted the exact reason why this is important to move forward. And that's what we're doing tonight. We're not voting on it tonight. We're making a motion to send it to council to vote, and then this will go on the ballot in March. But between now and March, we've got a lot of work to do specifically on this measure, to the concerns you brought up.
Sure, I understand all of that. I'm just advocating for parks, and pointing out that even if we use the entire 1.1 million, that's 11 million over 10 years, and that is 1/3 of the potential total that you mentioned. And I'm not sure you were adequately adding in, repairs to Fox Creek and the some of the rural areas. So I am not interested in an argument. I'm just interested in throwing some data out there. As member of council, I'll get to vote on it too. So it's not my problem, except that I would hate to go back and explain to people, oh, we can't do this or that for parks because we're spending it all on erosion control. That's all.
Okay. Councilmember Clark. Councilmember Clark.
I have a question, and it may be really a stupid question, but what we keep like hanging our hat on this tax, if it doesn't pass, and even if it does, we still have all of this cost to incur. And do we have a plan B for paying for the rest of it and paying for all of it if the tax wouldn't pass?
Mr. Vunich.
Councilmember Clark, and this is something that Mr. Cross has educated me on multiple times over the course of the last couple of months. When the mayor began the strategic planning process for the next 5 years, the second highest priority of City Council was developing new revenue sources that was squeezed between rural internet and watershed erosion. And so again, I think you all as elected officials will have to come to terms with this sooner than later as part of this strategic planning process. And a lot of the questions that are being raised tonight and concerns hopefully will be addressed and either alleviated or minimized so that we do have a plan not only for stormwater and parks and capital improvements, but internet as well.
So seeing no hands, do we have a motion to push this to council? Mr. Gunther, do we have a second? Seconded by Councilmember Farmer. We've got a motion on the floor. Any discussion, Mr. Garitano?
Yeah, I just wanted to get clarity though. I mean, don't we need to get all the answers for the council? I'm worried that if we bring it to council, you're going to get the same questions there. And, we're just not going to be able to move forward until we get the accounting, the breakdown of how the tax will be applied, what percentage to parks versus stormwater, and then what projects will they go towards the stormwater. I just feel they're gonna ask those questions before they put their name on voting on a bill like this.
I don't think it's going to be specifically set out what percentage goes where and when. It's just going to be up to the council every year to spend. Okay, we're spending this. We need this much for parks. We need this much for stormwater, and based on how much the stormwater task force gets, that's the project we'll be able to afford.
So I guess, how do I answer the question? You're asking for money. What are you going to do with it?
Well, it's based on project, and you guys decide on how much money we get.
Right, but then we need to know the project, and we need to know where it's going to, because otherwise, then why? The next question is there a sunset provision? Why, or that? I think there's just too much ambiguity. But that's my opinion. Maybe my fellow council members might feel that they'll vote more. I'm thinking it might be, we need to get a little bit of that data there for them.
We've got a whole list of projects. I'm a little bit concerned of that. We have the projects already.
Is there a cost breakdown to those projects? And then how much goes in the first year? So we saw that the projected revenue is 1.1 million, but we don't have an answer yet. I'm sorry to say, but we don't know what percentage is going to stormwater versus parks. And we don't know then the percentage that's allocated to stormwater, which projects it's going to. The voters are going to ask those questions.
Yeah, they're going to ask that question in November of this year. We're talking about discussing putting this to council right now to move it forward to get to that point. I guess to your point, there's probably no urgency to send it to council immediately next month or next from that perspective. I can understand that because we don't actually have to put it forth to the count or to the state to put it on the ballot. But I'm not sure that I agree with what your rationale is specifically. We don't need to have the breakdown every year up front and then say these projects. That's exactly what we just spent the last hour and a half on, is going through the prioritization. And those projects are going to be the ones that are going to benefit from such a funding stream. That's why we're talking about them. We have no other pools, pots of money. There's no magic gold that we're going to find behind City Hall to pay for those projects. There may be some FEMA money that we're going to be able to apply for.
I think it'd just be helpful to have answers to like how the money is being applied, because what makes us determine that we're asking for, why do we need 1.1 million? Why aren't we asking for 500,000? Right? The things like that. I just mean to increase the best likelihood of success, I think that data, that supporting data needs to be provided. I feel it would be going blindly with this.
I don't disagree at all. I agree with you. Mr. Cross, and then we're going to go to Councilmember McCutcheon, then Councilmember Rambo, and then Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We have some competing priorities here, or we have some parallel projects. This task force is going to zero in on the priorities, however that shakes out. But Dr. Remy, you had mentioned to Councilmember McCutcheon, the efforts coming from the Parks and Planning Committee. At last night's meeting, Mr. Vunich and I were tasked with finding out everything we possibly could about a parks and stormwater tax. The city of Creve Coeur recently were successful in implementing that tax. We've been tasked with finding out how they did it, what period of time, how they're breaking it down, as much as we possibly can find out about, rather than just the generalities of it'll be a half-cent sales tax, and that based on our capital improvement sales tax, which is at the same 0.5%, we are generating anywhere from $1.2 to $1.4 million per year. But to really get into the specifics about how do you go about, if we're looking at trying to put this on the ballot in November, there's a lot of details. And so Mr. Vunich and I were tasked with doing all of that work and coming back to the Parks and Planning Committee 1 month from now. Okay. So taking it to committee, anytime soon would perhaps be premature, given the fact that we have two things going on: the prioritization, what we're looking at, and how we're going to go about going after this tax. So I just wanted you all, who may not have been part of that conversation last evening at the P&P committee meeting, that Mr. Vunich and I have quite a bit of work to do over the next few weeks.
No, I appreciate that. That's good context to provide to the group. Next up is Ms. Holthouse, then followed by Councilmember Clark, then Rambo.
First, I'd just like to let Mr. Cross know that we have, with Mike Patton's good efforts, already done a lot of research on the Creve Coeur ballot initiative, and we've got their materials and timeline and that sort of thing. So if you wanted to start with that, and the headline was they really were kind of like less is more. They just didn't make a big deal of it, built on the support, the people they knew they could support, that were going to support it, and tried to avoid, creating unnecessary interest since they thought they already had it over the finish line. Secondly, I guess in terms of taking it forward to City Council, I guess they could vote yes, they could vote no, or I would hope before they would vote no, they might say, well, we've really got some more questions. And so I think maybe they could be a good test case for the kind of pushback we're going to get from the larger community in terms of whether we can really just say, hey, there's this urgent need, these are the kind of urgent projects we're looking at. Here's why we think they're important to fund. Here by any estimate is, a total that's far more than, all of the tax would fund. And we know we're going to have to, juggle and sort it out over the long term, year by year, in terms of exactly how it gets spent. So I think we need to know what questions the public is going to ask and make sure we have answers for those in November. But I guess rather than trying to anticipate what all those questions might be. Maybe the city council can be our test case for our pitch, if you will.
Councilmember Cutchin, I forgot you're up next, and then Councilmember Clark.
So I think Councilmember Garantano made some good points. While the specifics, I think we differ a little bit on. But as far as taking it to council at this point, I don't think we're ready. I think council is going to have a lot of questions, especially some of the issues that Mr. Cross just mentioned a few minutes ago that we came up with PMP. And I think we need to go forward with council with all the answers that we can possibly come. We came up with some good questions, and they're going to have a tremendous amount of impact as far as presenting the tax to the voters. So I think we really need to wait till we get that information, and then some of the information that this committee just asked for earlier before we move it to council. I think we should get our facts and our ducks in a row before we go to council, because even when we go to council with very good and solid data, they're still going to have some questions. So I think we need to put ourselves in the best position that we can with actual facts and data before we actually take it to council. So I can't support taking it to council at this point.
Okay, Councilmember Clark.
Dr. Rambo was before me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Councilmember Rambo.
Yeah, we're getting to the point where we're beating a dead horse here, but I agree with Ms. McCutcheon and Mr. Garantano. We're not ready yet. I would indeed ask many of the same questions in council, already knowing that we don't have the answers. And so it seems a bit like a waste of time to me. I do know, just speaking as a citizen, that I would get lots of questions from some of the folks on Fox Creek, et cetera, about the details of what we're trying to repair with the stormwater portion, and whatever that turns out to be, which would be a whole nother set of questions. And when I say it's all going to be in Cox Creek, that would make it a difficult sale. And so the only saving grace is that it's supposed to fund the parks, and we don't know how much of the park, how much funding will go to parks. And so we're just not ready for it. I would suggest again that the council needs to have sort of a strategic planning session just for funding mechanisms for these various projects, because we have a number. We know it might be 20, 30 million. We've got a good handle on internet. We've got, we have numbers to work with. We've got the potential for utility tax. We got, that may be all we need for internet, et cetera, et cetera. So we could plan that out, and then this committee would have a whole lot better idea about, what's possible. So didn't break any new ground there, but I just wanted to throw it out again and also support Ms. McCutcheon and Mr. Garantano. Thank you.
Councilmember Clark.
I would like to amend the motion to postpone taking it to council until we have the answers to the questions we had tonight, and that we assist Mr. Vunich in putting this matrix together so that it answers all the criteria that we have for prioritizing our own.
So procedurally, there's no postponing. It's procedurally we can just ask the makers of the motion if they'll withdraw the motion.
Okay.
So Mr. Gunther is the maker of the motion. Would you like to withdraw your motion?
Yeah, hearing the discussion, I would withdraw the motion, and hopefully we can make this motion at the next meeting, because I also heard we have January, February, March to get going. So I'll withdraw.
Okay, motion's withdrawn, so there's no actionable item then to go to council from that perspective procedurally. And duly heard everybody's concerns and questions. I do think Ms. Holthouse actually has, and Mr. The Patton have done a phenomenal job in getting a lot of that information. So I think perhaps maybe at the next meeting too, that information could be presented to the task force at whole. That would help, I think, fill some of those holes if that's allowed. Mr. Garantano, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overstep here.
No worries. And again, I'm just trying to provide comment. I think just like the other councilmen, we want this to be solid when it goes to council, because if it goes to council, it's just going to get punted back to the task force. to get the answers. That's how it works. So, and anyway, the minutes reflect this committee already voted on December 2nd that regarding the date. So all that's needed is really just the revenue breakdown, and then how the expenditures will be broken down, at least for the first year or first couple of years, those projected, just like we do in the city with our capital improvement projects, like looking at a 5-year outlook. So some of that's going to have to be, I think, like we talked early on in the meeting, get those estimates of what the work's going to be done and how it's going to be spent and what years and when. So that's it.
Would it be acceptable for this task force for Mr. Archeski, myself, Councilmember McCutcheon, Mr. Vunich, and Mr. Cross, and Mr. Brown, maybe if we met and try to work through at least between the two committees about what that breakdown might look like based off of what the priorities for Mr. McCutcheon are and for the task force, and maybe come up with what maybe a 1 to 3 years might look like for that breakdown, and if it's 50-50 or 75-30 or 30-70, 35-30-70, that might be helpful then. So when we present it to her committee and my committee, that we're both on the same page. Would that be reasonable?
Fine with me.
Fine with me.
Okay, so then we have some work to do. Okay, so why don't we do that, even though my math at rapid fashion was off because I haven't slept since yesterday morning. So all right. Well, I appreciate the dialogue for this one. There's no hands. Furthermore, so in the interest of time, why don't we move on to our next agenda item, which is introduction to stormwater master plan process. Oh, I'm sorry. Update on stormwater impact fees and stream stewardship trust fund. I apologize.
I believe Ms. Arnett prepared this memorandum. I'm going to let her speak to it.
Actually, newly promoted senior planner Newberry is the one who wrote this memo. However, at an hour and a half or 2 hours into the meeting, I'll let him speak next time, and I will just say we're working on both of these items. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them, but I don't think we need to belabor it at this point.
Would you like to just add it to the agenda item for next meeting?
It will be on there. Thank you.
Okay. In the interest of time, the next one is introduction to stormwater master plan process. Why don't we have, Mr. Vunich, do you think we'll be able to do next to you in a reasonable short fashion?
I would
if I don't talk as much.
I would respectfully request a postponement to the next meeting.
Okay. Is there a motion to postpone the next two agenda items to the next meeting? Made by
So
Councilmember McCutcheon, seconded by Councilmember Clark. All in favor of postponement, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, any abstentions? Okay. In interest of time, Ms. Holthouse, is there anything from your education subcommittee that you wanted to present this evening?
Just that we're bumping along with the plan that we outlined in December. Thanks to Kathy and the folks at City Hall, there'll be an article in the upcoming newsletter that covers erosion issues. And we've gotten sign off on the sample from Dr. Hammer of extracting short content from his comprehensive training program and breaking it into bite-sized pieces for distribution through other channels. So we're making progress, and we'll be happy to. I've got some drafts of things I may circulate or post somewhere for comment, but nothing that we need to walk through tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Anything from the other subcommittee related to master plan or ordinance review? Okay.
Just one item.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Hammer is working on the ordinance review. Him and I kind of circled the wagons after the first of the year, and that I put that as a priority.
Perfect. Looking forward to hearing about that at the next meeting. Other matters of consideration, I don't have any. I'll just make one last comment. Honestly, we made some good progress tonight. We're moving forward. I mean, even though there's some key questions, we're moving forward with key components of this, and I'm really proud of this task force. Mr. Gunther, I didn't mean to cut your hand off there, sir.
Still have it. I do have one quick question. I think it's very timely, if I may, and I'm sorry to extend the meeting. I read with interest in the the West News Magazine, this last issue, that Wildwood bridges are to be replaced. 2 bridges on Wild Horse Creek Road and Ozenfort Road. And I just wanted to ask if we are going forward with our own best practices, if there's any kind of intervention in the creek beds themselves, we'll be using our best practices and applying those, i.e. the living wall and so on versus riprapping. And so I wonder if that's been taken into consideration, or can we commit to that as a city, especially in light of all we've been talking about tonight?
Mr. Brown or Mr. Ron, do you want to take those?
I would just say we're going to do our best to consider the many concerns that have been brought forth by the task force. I know Councilmember Edens has brought this up already with regard to commenting on the bridge project. So we'll be sure to do our best in that regard and keep the task force apprised.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. If there's no other items for consideration this evening, our next meeting is on February the 24th at 6:30 p.m. We've got some work to do before that meeting, but if there's no opposition, can I get a motion for adjournment? Made by Councilmember Farmer, seconded by Councilmember Rambo. All in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? And any abstentions? Thank you all very much. Much appreciated. Everyone stay safe.
Thanks for your leadership tonight.
Good job, Dr. Remy.
Thank you, guys. Bye.